Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's gonna die. Come watch TV.
A couple of months ago, I sat down and watched all of Rick and Morty, and it took me rewatching it again to begin to understand why I found the show so interesting. Interesting enough to rewatch in its entirety. It is a strange show, to say the least. A show that started with a bit of high-effort trolling. Justin Roiland created Back to the Future, the new official Universal Studios cartoon featuring the new Doc Brown and Marty McFly, as a humorous middle finger to the bigger studios, to copyright law, to Universal, and to the absurd trend of remake sequels and properties being dug from the grave for soulless $100 million films. He waited for the cease and desist and instead ended up with a terrible idea that had the potential to be a bigger, maybe less terrible thing. It was the very thing that would become Rick and Morty.
Get riggedy wrecked up!
And what that was, as creators Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland put it, a science fiction adventure juxtaposed with a domestic family drama. But it didn't get that much less strange, and somehow we the viewer have to be invested in all of that. And upon completing that rewatch of the final Rick and Morty product, I think it's obvious that the one thing Rick and Morty is doing better than so many other shows has almost everything to do with its characters. Rick and Morty treats its characters as vehicles for understanding, or lenses through which we're meant to understand what's happening in front of us. This starts with Morty. Roiland and Harmon believed they needed a character that saw the world as we do. A character that could, as they put it, be the way through which we understand this world's developments. Morty is our voice, and that voice shifted as our perception did. As Morty discovers the world, as he begins to have his own morality and understanding of the universe tested, he responds like the writers expect us to, in a general sense. The shock of seeing the unknown, the confusion of trying to make sense of this. If we were fed Rick's adventures without that filter, without Morty's voice, that soundboard of sorts, it would normalize the absurdity. The show would lose its edge, and worse yet, we'd be less incentivized to question the morality of Rick's actions. We'd be less inclined to question Rick's actions in general, undermining anything the show actually had to say. And Roiland and the writers understood this. Over the course of 3 seasons, we see Morty go from this to this.
I don't know what my reaction is, but I think I'm mounting in suspicion of you.
Well, what are you gonna do?
I'm gonna remember everything!
If Morty had stayed that starry-eyed, fearful sponge for 3 seasons, we would adjust to this fictional world before he does, and that lens would disappear. But he doesn't. His vision of this world, its futility, its lack of structure and consistency shapes Morty. It changes him, and he slowly begins to normalize the things he's seeing as we, too, begin to expect them from the show. Rick and Morty wants us to view their world, subconsciously or even consciously, the way Morty does. At least for the most part. And because it's successful at this, Morty becomes a grounding figure in these less than grounded adventures. But it's Rick that shapes this world.
When you know nothing matters, the universe is yours, and I've never met a universe that was into it.
If Morty is the vehicle by which the writers want us to understand the developments of the show, Rick is the entity by which we question them. Rick is a nihilist. He believes to his core that nothing truly matters, and if you've seen a second of this show, this isn't a revelation. The show is fueled by cosmicism, a Lovecraftian philosophy that states that humans aren't governed by a god and instead, they're just specks in a much larger painting, a stroke in a filled frame. See, Morty, as the writers put it, accepts these things as he sees them throughout the show. He rationalizes them in every way he can. Rick, on the other hand, doesn't want to rationalize anything. He's a ticking time bomb of self-loathing and mental illness. What Rick and Morty often becomes then is a balancing act that Rick creates. Again, Roiland and Harmon wanted to create a sci-fi family drama, and Rick is the fabric holding those two things together. He's also the very thing tearing it apart, the link between those two ambitions, or worlds. Rick is the only reason we care about either of them. Rick is the source of the show's development, that thing Morty is written to help us understand and react to. Jerry starts as a brutally bland doormat for his family. His position as a patriarch is questioned by his family and the viewer. The threat of Rick's presence as a more important and paternal figure is the very thing that gives the writers the opportunity to create and complete Jerry's redemption arc, if you can call it that. Rick's presence also exposes Jerry's position in the family to Beth, which leads her further coming to terms with her dissatisfaction with her life. Her happiness, her reasoning for staying in this position, again, questioned by her and the viewer thanks to Rick. But Rick and Jerry's relationship in turn creates her...
Oh my god, I'm my father!
sociopathic discovery. Rick almost is written and functions as a villain would. He is the conflict that creates resolution and growth. Roiland at one point said that he wanted Morty to be that reactionary vehicle, but he didn't want us to like Rick, or maybe even Morty to like Rick. The writers accomplished that very thing, but also managed to avoid creating that villain. We don't hate Rick, we just don't love him. And the fact that he can act so consistently as the inciter of the issues without being that villainous character is an accomplishment of writing.
Yep, it really makes you appreciate how little time we all have. You know, 1 minute you're falling off a roof, 3 months later, bam, 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 bam. Time quake.
But while Rick and Morty's leads are written with very specific individual purposes, I think it's actually Beth, Summer, and Jerry that do the best job of grounding the show. There is nothing at all relatable about Morty and Rick's off-world adventures. In fact, these adventures seem determined to do nothing but drive home the nihilism Rick is so firmly entrenched in. There's humor, but the humor in these moments mostly comes from shock comedy. It has to. It, by definition, according to Rick, is meaningless. So where Morty is used to ground the connection between the family and Rick, the writers use Beth, Jerry, and Summer to ground the story, to make sure the narrative still resonates, to make sure it's still at least in some way relatable. They're the opposition to Rick's nihilism. They're the people that believe that things can, and often do, matter. So the writers have them deal with tiny versions of Rick's problems, but they have them do it often enough in a place we recognize, their home. A place we can relate to. While Rick is questioning his existence in space, the Smith family is defending their existence on Earth. And what this duality does for the viewer is make sure that the Smiths don't feel disconnected from Rick and Morty's view and perception of this universe, even when the way they view the world is different. It makes sure that they're exposed to some of the same things, which makes their more hopeful and optimistic, well, sometimes optimistic positions much more believable. It's not just, oh, you haven't seen what Rick's seen, it's, oh, you have, and while you may not comprehend it quite as much, you still care. And so when the show becomes that family drama, when Jerry and Beth fight, when Rick loses his place in their home, when Summer struggles with who she is and identity, it feels like narrative that's directly tied to the same things that Rick and Morty have and are experiencing. There's little disconnect. Rick and Morty the show uses its characters, sometimes instead of stories, to keep you invested in their world, no matter how separated they become. And from a writing perspective, that's what separates bad shows from the better ones. Look, Rick and Morty is not a perfect show, its reception being a clear indication of that. But one thing that Rick and Morty understands better than a long list of shows that precede it is how to write characters, or maybe more succinctly, how to develop a group of characters. If you remove a single one of the 5 main characters from Rick and Morty, with maybe sometimes the exception of Summer, the show ceases to have the same resonance as it does now. You lose an important portal designed from the ground up to show you a different side of this world. What Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon and the writers have created is a self-contained universe that treats each character with a level of understanding that too many shows lack, and they ask you to understand them as well. And they've built characters that have grown or regressed with the audience. Bad characters, archetypal characters, static characters are viewed passively, and thus their impact is lessened. Say what you will about these 5 characters, but they are the vehicles for some of the most interesting writing on television.
Wow, hey, look you guys, the sun's rising.
Plus, there's this. That's a wrap on today's episode of Nerdstalgic. If you enjoyed it, as always, press that like button down below. If you haven't yet done so, press subscribe as well. Also, the little bell next to the subscribe button, just notification bell, as I always say, it just makes sure you're actually notified when I put out a video, so hit the little bell too. And as always, on your screen right now are 2 more episodes of Nerdstalgic. You can click on either of those to see more from me in this channel, and I will see you guys in the next video.